Welcome back to another collection of time slip stories, or in other words, people who believe they've gone to a different time period. I tried to find as many as I could, but there isn't really too many time slip stories out there, so I hope you'll enjoy what we have here. Anyways, make sure to subscribe and like if you want to support the video, it helps a lot, and let's get straight into it. The Dunster Case. In 1993, a couple named Alf and Aileen Roberts were on holiday in Dunster, a quaint village located in Somerset, England. After spending a day exploring the countryside, they decided to set off for their hotel. It was around 7:30 p.m. when everything changed. The couple suddenly found themselves lost in a nearby village called Bampton. At first glance, Bampton seemed like a typical English village, but something about it stood out. The village green was covered with vibrant flowers, all arranged, and a wooden plaque declared it the best kept village of 1976. The sight of the flowers and the plaque itself intrigued Alf and Aileen, but after admiring the scene for a moment, they thought little of it and continued on their way, eventually making their way back to their hotel in Dunster. The village, while charming, didn't really feel out of place to them at that moment. The following day, however, their curiosity got the better of them. Alf and Aileen decided to return to Bampton, hoping to capture some photos of the flower display they had seen the previous evening. But what they found when they arrived left them completely baffled. The village green, once vibrant and filled with flowers, was now stark and bare. There was no sign of the floral display at all, nor was the wooden plaque declaring it the best kept village of 1976 anywhere to be found. What was even stranger was that the entire appearance of the village seemed to have shifted. It was as if they had wandered into a completely different version of Bampton. The buildings and surroundings, though recognizable, looked considerably different from the village they had seen just the day before. The transformation was unsettling. 2 years later, in 1995, the Roberts shared their story on the television series Strange But True. They recounted how, when they had left Bampton the previous night, the time on their watches had remained unchanged at 7:30 p.m., even though they had been in the village for what felt like a considerable amount of time. It was as if time itself had stood still while they were in Bampton, a detail that only added to the eerie feeling that something beyond explanation had occurred. Aileen described the experience as though they had entered the same village, but in an entirely different time. Upon returning home from their holiday, the couple began researching the village of Bampton, hoping to make sense of what they had encountered. Their findings, though, only deepened the mystery. It turned out that Bampton had indeed been awarded the title of Best Kept Village, but that had happened years earlier in 1976, exactly as the plaque had stated. The Gadianton Canyon Incident. The Gadianton Canyon Incident is a strange and often discussed tale of a time slip that supposedly took place in southeastern Utah near Modena, close to the Escalante Desert. The story centers around four college girls, Jana North, Carol Abbott, Lisa Rochfort, and Bethany Gordon, who were returning to their dorm after a night out, traveling in a 1971 Chevrolet Nova. It was after 10 p.m. when they crossed the Utah-Nevada state line, anxious to beat their curfew, which their strict house mother enforced with locked doors after midnight. As they made their way along Highway 56, a desolate stretch surrounded by sand, sagebrush, and red sandstone bluffs, the girls spotted the Union Pacific Railroad crossing in Modena. But just past the crossing, they noticed something really unusual. It was that two roads appeared right ahead of them. One road veered sharply southeast into the desert, while the other headed northeast towards the Gadianton Canyon. In their rush to return on time, the girls decided to take what seemed like a shortcut through the canyon, hoping it would get them back to their dorm faster. But as they ventured deeper into Gadianton Canyon, the road began to change. The familiar black asphalt completely disappeared, replaced by white cement, and the surroundings became increasingly alien. Despite this, they continued to drive, with their nerves rising, until the road abruptly ended at a towering rock wall. Forced to turn around, they quickly realized that the landscape had shifted dramatically. What had once been an open desert had now transformed into grain fields and a shimmering lake illuminated by a moon that shouldn't have been visible that night. They found themselves in a place that was clearly no longer the Utah they knew. Distressed, the girls pressed on, hoping to find a way back. After a little while, they encountered a large building, being a roadhouse or restaurant, sitting in the middle of a parking lot out of nowhere. The neon sign on the roof was unlike anything they had ever seen. The symbols were incomprehensible, bizarre squiggles and curves that bore no resemblance to any written language they recognized. As they pulled into this parking lot, they noticed a group of tall men emerging from the building. These figures seemed startled and frightened by the sight of the Chevrolet, and some of them even waved their arms and shouted in alarm. The girls' initial curiosity quickly turned to terror as Lisa, trying to interact with the men, suddenly screamed in horror. Something about these men was deeply disturbing, as if they weren't quite human. Jana slammed her foot on the gas and the Chevy roared out of the parking lot. As they sped away, they realized they were being pursued by strange egg-shaped vehicles mounted on tricycle-like wheels, with a single white headlight glaring from the front of each. These vehicles closed in on them, emitting a strange whirring sound as they gained speed. Panic gripped the group as they hurtled down the road, the Nova's engine straining at 80 miles per hour. The egg-shaped cars continued their pursuit as well, even as the girls plunged back into the narrow canyon. But as they emerged from the canyon, the road beneath them vanished, and the car bucked wildly over the rough desert terrain. After careening out of control, the Chevy finally crashed into an arroyo, its engine dying and 3 of its tires flat. Shaken up but uninjured, the girls climbed out of the wrecked car and huddled together until sunrise. When daylight finally came, they walked until they found the familiar blacktop of Highway 56. Hours later, they flagged down a Utah Highway Patrol officer who listened to their story and investigated the site of the crash. What the officer found only deepened the mystery though, being there were no tire tracks showing where the car had left the highway, and the tire marks from the crash extended only 200 yards into the desert before disappearing. The right front hubcap of the Chevy was also missing, and despite a thorough search, it was never found. So yeah, overall, this canyon incident is a tale that sparked a lot of debate, with many doubting its authenticity. The girls' account of the night reads like a blend of time slip and interdimensional travel, along with unrecognizable landscapes, incomprehensible writing, and non-human entities, which does raise skeptics' thoughts. Skeptics point to several inconsistencies, like the fact that Modena is a tiny town with hardly any reason for the girls to be there, or that the canyon itself doesn't seem to exist on any map. But yet the story still persists and is passed down as one of the most bizarre accounts of unexplained phenomena in Utah. Some have tried to rationalize the incident, suggesting it could have been a case of mistaken perception or a psychological breakdown shared by the group. Others see the story as nothing more than a hoax or creepypasta or an urban legend. But for those who believe in the possibility of time slips, alternate dimensions, or interdimensional beings, it still is really interesting and fascinating to think about. A walk back in time in Moundsville, West Virginia. On Halloween night in 1989, 4 friends were walking through the quiet town of Moundsville, West Virginia, which is a place known for the Grave Creek Burial Mound, the largest Native American mound on this side of the Mississippi River. It was just past midnight and the group was heading home after a night at the local skating rink on 10th Street. Laughter echoed through the empty streets as the teens made their way down Tomlinson Avenue. Their destination was the home of one of the friends, located on 5th Street, which was a familiar path they had walked many times before. However, this particular walk would be unlike any other. One of the friends would later recount the incident, describing it with striking clarity, as though it had only happened the day before. These kinds of events, as she put it, are impossible to forget. As the group rounded the corner, passing the towering mound that gave the town its name, they noticed a subtle shift in their surroundings. They were no longer in the year 1989, nor was it nighttime. Instead, they found themselves walking on a bright October day, though the atmosphere around them felt different from the present they had just left behind. The air was cleaner and crisper, yet it carried with it a thick, rank odor, which was reminiscent of decaying meat left too long in the sun. Dust swirled in the breeze, settling on their clothes and in their hair, a nuisance they hadn't dealt with in their modern time. The paved road beneath their feet had transformed into a rough dirt path, and instead of the hum of cars or streetlights, there were horse-drawn carriages and people walking by in clothing from a bygone era. The women wore plain dresses and hats with their garments in muted drab colors. The group could also hear snatches of conversation as they passed, including mentions of Elizabethtown, which had been the original name of Moundsville in the early 1800s. As they continued walking, they noticed that the mound itself appeared different. More trees covered its surface, and it seemed somehow older, more worn by time. The townsfolk they passed were on their way to the West Virginia State Penitentiary, chatting about an upcoming public hanging. In the 19th century, such grim events were treated as social gatherings, drawing large crowds of families and friends who brought along picnic baskets to watch the executions from what is now 8th Street. The friends overheard bits of these conversations and could see people heading toward the area where the hanging was set to take place, further solidifying the sense that they had somehow crossed into another time. As the friends walked on in growing disbelief, one of them reached out to pet a dog that wandered near. But instead of feeling the familiar texture of fur beneath her fingers, she described the sensation as if she were touching jello. The dog's form seemed soft and malleable, not at all what would one expect from a living, breathing animal. Just as she was processing this strange occurrence though, a horse-drawn carriage passed directly to the group. The sensation was unlike anything they had ever felt, being it was cold but not wet, more similar to the feeling of being submerged in water without getting wet. They likened it to sitting in a hot tub with the jets on full blast, with the water pressure creating ripples on their skin, even though nothing physical had actually touched them. Frightened by what they were experiencing, the four friends hurried past the mound. As quickly as the shift had occurred, it ended. They suddenly found themselves back in 1989, the familiar streets of Moundsville stretching out ahead of them under the cool night sky. Shaken, they ran home, eager to tell their families what just happened. When they arrived, they encountered the mother of one of the friends, along with another adult who had come looking for them. The group was late returning home, and the adults had left the house around 12:20 a.m. to search for them. The strange part though was that the adults had walked the same route along Tomlinson Avenue, but hadn't seen the group at all. When they finally spotted them, it was near the intersection of Tomlinson and 7th Street, and the time was now 12:30 a.m. Though the friends had only felt as though they had been gone for minutes, they had actually been missing for half an hour. When the adults asked where they had been, the friends recounted their surreal experience in vivid detail, but naturally the story was met with skepticism. The only physical evidence they had to back up their claims was the dirt on their shoes and jeans. It was a fine, tan dust that couldn't have come from anywhere in their present time, as the roads were paved and the yards were full of grass. There was also no source of such dirt for miles around, which only added to the surreal nature of the experience. As they hurried home, they couldn't stop talking about what happened, recounting every strange detail, desperate to make sense of it all. In the days and weeks that followed, the group of friends began to drift apart, their bond seemingly fractured by the strangeness of that night. They all collectively avoided the path past the mound, opting to take longer routes to their destinations, as though afraid that the past might once again pull them in. None of them could explain why it had happened, and the memory of the October day from another time lingered with them, a shadow over their everyday lives. They never walked that route together again. The Riverside time slip of Carol Chase McElhenney. On a rainy day in 2006, Carol Chase McElhenney found herself driving through San Bernardino, California, en route to a sheepdog trial in the nearby town of Paris. As the rain lashed her car, she suddenly saw a road sign for Riverside, a place which was deeply rooted in her family's history. Basically, her grandparents had lived there, and it was a town she had visited countless times since she was a baby. The idea of revisiting Riverside, of stopping by her childhood home and the cemetery where her grandparents were buried, seemed like a comforting notion. She was familiar with the area, she knew every street and turn, and there was no doubt in her mind that she could find her way. But as Carol thought about her grandparents, something strange happened. A strong, unmistakable scent of cigar smoke filled her car. It was an odd occurrence as the windows were rolled up tightly because of the pouring rain. The scent took her by surprise because her grandfather, who had died when she was only 5, used to smoke a lot of cigars. That scent, associated so strongly with their memory of him, was suddenly and inexplicably present, only to vanish just as quickly as it appeared. Shaken but trying to keep her focus, she pressed on, driving past Riverside and continuing to Paris to check into her hotel for the night. The next day, after attending the first sheepdog trial, Carol decided to drive to Riverside to explore the old, familiar places from her past. However, as she finally entered the city, a weird feeling began to wash over her. The Riverside she always knew wasn't there. The streets that once had been so familiar were now strange and unrecognizable. The street where she had lived after college no longer seemed the same. The bungalows lining the road were of the right era, and the house numbers matched what she remembered, but her childhood home was gone. The place where it should have stood didn't feel right. She couldn't believe that someone had torn it down and replaced it with a replica built in the 1920s style. It didn't make sense. The houses were similar in age to what she remembered, but something was off, as though she had entered a version of the past that no longer existed. Determined to find something familiar, Carol drove to her grandmother's old street. But again, she was met with confusion. The houses were completely different from what she remembered. There were no towering trees that once shaded the street. Her mother's large Tudor-style house, as well as her aunt and uncle's home next door, were also both gone. Instead, modern ranch-style homes lined the street, flanked by bushes and ordinary landscaping. The street numbers fell within the range she expected, but the homes that should have been there had vanished, as though erased from existence. Next, Carol drove to the cemetery where her grandparents had been buried, hoping to find at least one constant in the rapidly shifting landscape of her memory. But when she arrived, the cemetery was nowhere to be found. The lot where it should have been was fenced off and overgrown with weeds. There was no gate, no headstones, no sign that it had ever been a cemetery. The place where her grandparents had been buried was now an empty, forgotten place, as if their final resting place had been swallowed by time. Feeling increasingly uneasy, Carol decided to drive through the city, searching for anything that might anchor her in reality. She found herself passing by Riverside City College and Central Middle School, places that looked just as she remembered. They stood as small islands of familiarity in a sea of confusion. Encouraged by these glimpses of the past, she ventured further, turning onto University Avenue, once a bustling street lined with restaurants, businesses, and motels. But University Avenue too had transformed into something unrecognizable. The area that had once been lively and well kept now looked derelict and frightening. Graffiti completely covered the walls, and the street was deserted, except for a few shady figures who seemed out of place in the Riverside Carol had known. The street, once a thriving city, now felt dangerous and decayed. The Mission Inn, a historic landmark that always stood proudly on University Avenue, was also gone. The more and more Carol explored, the more she realized that the Riverside of her memories was disappearing before her eyes. Nothing matched up at all. Everything looked distorted, as though she had stumbled into a version of the city that had taken a darker, more sinister turn. The strangest thought crossed her mind as she continued driving. She began to believe that if she got out of her car and interacted with anyone on the street, something terrible would happen. She felt as though the people she saw were entirely human, as though they were part of an eerie, alternate version of reality. The overwhelming feeling was that if she stopped and spoke to any of them, she might become trapped in this twisted version of Riverside, unable to escape. After hours of searching for something familiar, Carol finally gave up. She turned her car around and headed back to Paris. The moment she left Riverside and returned to the outskirts of the city, everything returned to normal. When she arrived at her hotel, everything was exactly as it should be. Her key worked, her room was there, and the world seemed stable again. The strange, disorienting experience was behind her, but the confusion and unease lingered. Years later, Carol's father passed away, and she returned to Riverside to bury him in the same cemetery where her grandparents lay. To her surprise, the cemetery had reappeared, exactly as she remembered it from her childhood. Her father was then buried beside her grandparents, and the city seemed to have righted itself. The houses she had remembered, including her grandmother's Tudor-style house, were all where they should be. University Avenue, which was once dangerous in her previous visit, had returned to its former state, bustling with life. The Mission Inn was also back, standing proudly as it always had, and she even had lunch there with her cousin. The place that didn't exist. In the summer of 2011, a peculiar incident occurred when two sisters, on a routine errand to collect a wheelchair for their mother, found themselves caught in a really weird situation. The family friend they were visiting, known here as Jen, lived in a remote lakeside subdivision in South Carolina. The girls were really familiar with the route, having visited Jen's home multiple times over the previous 2 years, so they felt confident in navigating the journey. Leaving around 6 p.m., they made their way through the long stretches of Southern Highway in their old car, expecting a straightforward trip to Jen's home. Upon entering the subdivision, the sisters wound their way through the sloping lakeside roads. These roads were lined with numerous mobile homes perched on small, overgrown properties, making it difficult to distinguish where one yard ended and the next began. They were confident though that they knew where Jen's house stood, but as they reached the spot where her double-wide trailer should have been, they were confronted with an unsettling scene. In place of the familiar home was an empty lot, and a man who neither of the girls recognized was mowing the vacant space. His sweaty face bore a strange grin that sent a chill through them. The subdivision was laid out in a circular pattern, and the sisters decided to turn right, believing they might have simply driven past Jen's house by mistake. They figured it would take around 10 minutes to loop back to the entrance and locate the home. However, as they continued driving, the road took an unexpected turn. What should have been a flat, familiar stretch of road began to rise in a series of steep, unnatural slopes. The older sister, trying to remain calm for the sake of her younger sibling, continued driving, though the unease in the car was palpable. As the road climbed higher and higher, the landscape around them began to change. No longer could they see the scattered homes they were accustomed to, but instead they were surrounded by dense, unyielding forest on both sides. The climb became even more intense, with sharp inclines followed by deep, gully-like descents. The sisters, growing more anxious by the minute, realized they had been driving for far longer than they should have. It had been over 20 minutes and there were no signs of any other cars or homes, only the strange, unsettling wilderness. The younger sister expressed her growing fear, but the older one, attempting to maintain composure, assured her that everything was fine, even though she too felt the same mounting dread. The silence outside the car became oppressive, and the air seemed to thicken with tension. When they reached the top of a particularly steep hill, the incline was so severe that the older sister had to hold the brake with all her strength as the car descended the other side. By this point, 30 minutes had passed since they had entered the subdivision, and nothing about their surroundings made sense. The sisters then decided to completely stop the car. They rolled down the windows to escape the suffocating heat, only to be met with an eerie stillness. There were no birds, no wind, only the quiet hum of the car's engine and the sound of their own breathing. It was as though the world around them had completely gone silent. Attempting to reach Jen for directions, they discovered that neither of their phones had signals. It was at this moment they realized something was deeply wrong, and they decided to turn back. As they finally made a U-turn, the road that felt like a labyrinth of impossible hills and valleys suddenly straightened out. Within minutes, they found themselves back in familiar territory, with houses and people appearing as if nothing unusual had ever occurred. Families were out in their yards, children playing as though the strange winding road had never existed. In less than 7 minutes, they were completely back at the start of the subdivision, where Jen's house stood exactly as they remembered it. The sight of her home, so ordinary and unchanged, left the older sister feeling as though the blood had drained from her face. They hurried inside, collected the wheelchair, and left as quickly as possible. The mystery of that day continued to haunt the sisters. A year later, they returned to the subdivision out of curiosity, hoping to find some explanation for the bizarre experience. Yet, when they drove through the same roads, everything was as it should have been. No weird hills, no dense forests, and certainly no stretches of road that led them far away from reality. They then completed the loop around the subdivision in a mere 10 minutes, laughing nervously as the memory of what happened. The Ghost Diner. During a summer trip 2 years ago, a family experienced something they still can't quite explain. Years ago, when the family owned a racetrack in Ohio but lived in southeast Pennsylvania, road trips were a regular part of life. One trip in particular stands out though, being a strange stop on the way to meet the stepdad, who was driving separately with equipment in tow. The narrator, their mother, and sister were together, making their way along the turnpike when they decided to take a break and pull off at a random exit. They weren't really expecting much, just a quick bite before continuing the long drive. The exit led them to a desolate strip mall with faded pastel buildings, the kind that looked like time had forgotten them. There didn't seem to be a town nearby, and the whole place just sort of looked empty, almost abandoned. But there was a diner, and they hadn't eaten in hours, so they decided to give it a try. From the moment they stepped inside, something felt off. The food was terrible, not just bad, but completely tasteless. The people inside the diner barely spoke, and everyone seemed to be staring at them. The atmosphere wasn't dark, but there wasn't much light either, almost like a Denny's with a power outage. To make things even stranger, an unusual number of patrons had bandages on them, adding to the unsettling vibe. The only person who interacted with them was the waitress, who quietly took their order and rang them up when they were done. Feeling uncomfortable, the family agreed they'd rather skip eating than come back here. Before they left, they made a note of the exit in a small journal they kept in the glove compartment, marking it as a place to avoid in the future. Later that day, they arrived at the racetrack and mentioned the strange stop to the stepdad. His reaction caught them off guard. Normally, he hated taking time for food, calling it a waste that got in the way of life. But this time, he was fascinated. He had a wild theory, being that they hadn't just stopped at a bad diner. He thought they'd stumbled into a ghost diner and that the people inside might have been vampires. He went on and on about it, getting more excited as he talked. But the idea of vampires with visible wounds still covered in bandages didn't really seem plausible. After some back and forth with her mother, he calmed down, though the whole incident left a weird feeling hanging in the air. The weekend passed and it was time to head back home. On the drive, the stepdad, still curious, asked the narrator to ride with him. 2 hours into the trip, he unexpectedly pulled off at the same exit, intrigued by the memory of the strange diner and eager to see it for himself. He paid the toll and casually asked the attendant if there was a diner at the exit to make sure he had the right place. The attendant's response caught them off guard, being that there had been a diner but it had been burned down. This was startling enough, but the stepdad, still curious, wanted to see for himself. They drove over to the strip mall and found that it looked just as before, with one major difference being that the diner was now a charred ruin. There were no cars, no police tape, just the burnt remnants of a building. It was clear the area had been cleaned up, yet the damage was undeniable. As they got back onto the turnpike, they saw the same toll booth attendant. The stepdad, still baffled, asked about the diner again, and the attendant repeated that it had burned down. He asked if they knew what caused the fire, assuming it must have been recent. The attendant's answer left them stunned, being the fire hadn't occurred in the last few days, but 8 years earlier. It was an unbelievable moment, almost too strange to comprehend. The family had clearly eaten at the diner just a few days before, yet the place had burned down nearly a decade ago. There was no way to explain it, no way to reconcile the two experiences. The exit, the buildings, the diner, they had all been too real, but somehow lost to time. So that ends the video. I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you all for watching. Leave any feedback in the comments and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.